Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming back. Welcome to day 2 of ET4 Online. I want to start by asking you a couple of questions. First of all, my name is David Wicks, and I'm the program chair from Seattle Pacific University. I think I was supposed to say that. I have a couple of questions for you. First, how many of you would consider yourselves an emerging technology decision maker at your institution? A show of hands. Okay. And then how many of you, second question, how many of you wish you had more influence with the people who make or don't make emerging technology decisions at your school? That should be everyone. Okay. I have good news. Our plenary speakers for this morning, Audrey Waters and Steve Hargadon, are known for their no-holds-barred commentary on all things educational technology, with just a pinch of sarcasm and snarkiness reserved especially for emerging technologies and edtech leaders who missed the mark. Between the two of them, they have tested and written about every emerging educational technology created in the last 10 years. Slight exaggeration to gain approval of the speakers. They have interviewed every important edtech leader in the United States, except the elusive Nolan Bushnell. Would he be here, by the way, this morning? Okay, good, because I didn't have a plan if he was. And if you didn't get that joke, then obviously you're not keeping up with Audrey and Steve's weekly EdTech podcasts. That's okay. There's still hope for you. You can start down the path of improved decision-making and persuasion on your campus by committing now to keep up with the social commentaries of Audrey Water and Steve Hargadon, beginning with today's plenary. So let's give a big ET4 welcome to Audrey and Steve.
That was maybe the best introduction I think I've ever gotten. We're really delighted to be here. I'm Steve Hargadon, of course, and this is Audrey Waters. And we do a weekly podcast on educational technology. We're actually going to record this session, or the session's being recorded, and this is the one that we will put out for this week.
Right. And we actually didn't record a session last week, so we'll be catching up a little bit on news, riffing on some of the themes that we've been tracking for the last year, and I think having just a pinch of sarcasm and snarkiness.
Snarkiness. Yes. Okay, because my computer's not turning on, I'm switching to my tablet. Okay, so we're going to go through some stories from the last 10 days, educational technology stories, and use them as the framework for bringing out some of the ideas that do come out in our podcast. So Audrey, let's start with the thought piece you wrote on educational technology as content delivery.
Yes. And this is the image on the slides is one that I think both Steve and I use quite often in presentations. And I think that it says in the year 2000, but I think it's certainly a very common idea of how lots of people, but particularly those in the technology sector, tend to think about education. This notion that we will be able to sort of efficiently streamline material into students' brains. And really the idea started for me when I was listening to Sal Khan from Khan Academy speak at Blackboard 2012, in which he touted, as he touts on his website, that Khan Academy has delivered 160 million lessons. And I couldn't help but think of the same sign that appears on McDonald's, or a similar sign that appears on McDonald's that talks about billions of burgers served. And so I've just been thinking a lot about the way in which in the technology sector we think about lessons delivered, and we think about using technology as this way to deliver content, and I think greatly oversimplify this notion of learning, teaching and learning.
So I think there's something really valuable in the comparison of educational delivery and fast food. But before we get there, part of the reason I love this slide is that this was actually sort of a science fiction view at the time. And we've talked about the ways in which science fiction sort of predicts what we think is going to happen. And it feels like there are sort of two different ways that science fiction portrays learning.
Right. I think that there's this image, and I think that one of my favorites is from the movie The Matrix, with, as everyone knows, the world's greatest living actor, Keanu Reeves. In that moment where he's getting the knowledge of, I believe it's judo, injected again instantly into his mind, and he lies there and is filled with all of the knowledge you need to know about judo, and has this sort of profound whoa moment. And I think that that's very much the sense that if we can just use technology to deliver content, just like we deliver news, deliver web pages, serve up information, that we will have, dare I say, revolutionary neos out there changing the world. It's as simple as that.
Thank you. But there are other visions of education technology. Maybe every once in a while you'll see a movie and you'll see sort of a very Socratic outdoor scene with that kind of teaching versus the Neo or this particular postcard or the Spock brain getting implanted on bones in Star Trek.
Right, and I think that, I do think that when we think about that, but that scene, I think that the one that you're referring to is from Serenity, from the movie based on the television series Firefly, and this notion of what we'll be doing in the future is having conversations. We'll be interacting with each other socially. We'll be exploring ideas, which again is very different than this. I think again this sort of notion of grinding through textbooks and delivering that to students. It's inquiry and agency and student-driven exploration, learner-driven exploration, as opposed to let's fill brains.
So is there a tension in the sort of current surge in interest in educational technology, both from the standpoint of sometimes being thought of as this injection delivery method, but also is it also opening the door to a conversation about teaching and learning that we've needed for a long time?
I think so. I think that is one of the interesting things about Khan Academy is that questions of what do instructors do with video lessons and the conversations around flipping the classroom, if nothing else, is sort of forcing us to ask questions about what exactly do we do in the classroom? How are we using our time with students? Are we sort of recreating whether it's just delivering lessons through our own presence and voice, or are we using technology to sort of simplify or expedite that process? Or are there new things and different ways that we can think about what happens in the classroom thanks to tools like Khan Academy?
So one of the benefits of technology would be personalization. Mm-hmm. How is that different than individualization?
Well, I think that personalization is certainly one of the buzzwords that we're hearing a lot about, that this notion that, and it's actually, I think, a little ironic, because we're hearing about this notion that if we can scale everything up to this massive level, that somehow at the same time as having this huge scale where we're replicating and delivering content into everyone's brains at the same time, that you'll be able to sort of explore students.
But is that the description of a MOOC?
We'll get to that. We'll get to MOOCs, won't we? This notion that students will be able to explore content and through adaptive learning, the content will be delivered to them in a personalized manner, which is very different than sort of exploring things on your own and making a personal or individual's path to finding what matters to you.
It also feels like one of the great benefits of the technologies we're seeing now, the social aspects, are not actually being magnified as a part of the thinking about teaching and learning. Doug Rushkoff reminds us that social media is social right? That what's drawn all these people into these technologies is the social aspect. How do we think about scale versus social?
I think that that's a really interesting. I think that that's a really interesting problem, and one of the things that I think one of the reasons why I tend to be sort of skeptical of the promises of education revolution that Silicon Valley is promising is that they do tout scale, and that's actually something that the technology sector is very good at. Is sort of is scaling up technologies, helping us distribute content more easily. But scaling social is a lot harder. Scaling human connection is a lot more challenging. I think that we do have ways that we can connect with one another in new ways. We can interact with people online that we've not met face to face. So we can perhaps sort of bridge some of the geographic distance. But scaling social, I'm not sure that that's what we're doing, and I'm not sure that that's even what we're doing with Facebook.
So the interesting numbers coming out of Facebook are that for all the hundreds of friends that we have, we typically interact on a regular basis with between 4 and 8 people.
Or none of them in my case.
Right. You never answer my posts. So But clearly there's something really interesting there that gets lost for me in the sort of lens of McDonald's, billions served, of Khan Academy, this number of lessons, that the scale tends to overshadow the sort of smallness. So let's kind of go back to the food idea. So we were in San Francisco when this came up, and there was this idea that you could go to McDonald's or you could go to one of thousands of these tiny restaurants that have specific individual flavors and commitments to certain kinds of foods.
Right, locally grown.
Locally grown. So is there value in looking at that as a comparison?
I think that, I think that Sal Khan would probably say no. He'd probably say we're way off.
He'd probably say no, somewhat impolitely.
Yes, he might. He might. But I do think that we should think about this. I think that this notion of fast food versus this growing slow food movement is really interesting. And I think that this notion, this drive towards efficiency, which is a lot of what Silicon Valley again is promising, is that if we can just use more technology, then our lives will become more efficient. That we won't have these sort of we won't have messy and inefficient systems. We won't have messy and inefficient practices. Everything will be streamlined. And so that's a sort of a fast food option that you can drive through and get your burger, within 90 seconds of placing the order. Is a very different thing than sort of eating slowly, thinking slowly, waiting for food, having conversations. I think it's just a very different model of thinking about nutrition than that sort of dietary nutrition. But certainly, I like the idea of thinking about how can we have a sort of a slow intellectual movement, perhaps as opposed to this notion right now where we talk a lot about information overload, that we're bombarded with ideas constantly, and that we have to sort of process things and move on without thinking deeply or waiting and exploring things before we before we sort of make a decision, and in the case of someone like me, a technology writer, before we sort of write up a story, press publish, and then forget about it.
It feels like universities have been uniquely good at the slow food, right? At the kind of deep thinking. But the MOOC movement almost sort of looks like it's taking the best strengths away from that view of higher ed.
Should we talk about MOOCs or should we wait?
No, let's wait. Okay. I'm sorry. That was my fault.
I should examine.
Okay, so I like the garden imagery.
Yeah.
I think that whenever I hear that with regard to learning and how you help a learner, I enjoy that. And so I love sort of tying that into the food as well. It also feels like we're going to a unique period of time historically where the opportunities to do things in our vocations and avocations live in this long tail of interests that previously didn't have the ability to be sort of focused on. Does that relate to sort of how we think about education, mass production versus sort of personalized, agency-driven education, and what people will be doing in the future?
Oh, that's interesting. I think that in some ways, I think that we do have opportunities now to learn all sorts of, we've always had opportunities to learn all the time. I think that the moment that we're at now, that we're starting to recognize that learning happens everywhere. And we're starting to also think about ways in which people can get credit, perhaps academic credit, but perhaps not academic credit, for the learning that they do in informal settings, for their own sort of own learning paths, as opposed to, say, the path that's laid out by your major or your institution or your job, perhaps.
So as we see teaching and learning taking place outside of the institution, I think we're going to get to what may be a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction by institutions to protect that space, especially as we talk about University of Virginia.
Yes.
Okay, so I don't want to leave this delivery, con, McDonald's theme without talking about data.
Yes.
Right? Because I really love what Amazon does for me when it surfaces a book that I wouldn't have otherwise known. When some algorithm in the background looks at what I've ordered and looks at what I'm searched for and says, oh, you might like this book. How's that different from a lot of the discussion that goes on about big data right now?
I think that I would say that this push towards education data, learning analytics is certainly one of the growing and increasingly important trends. And it's not surprising. I mean, the more and more we conduct our lives online, we are leaving behind what Tim O'Reilly calls data exhaust. So every click that a student makes in a learning management system, every click that you make online, it's likely that things are being tracked, that data is being tracked, and there could be a lot of perhaps some pretty interesting information that we can glean about what students are doing, what students are thinking, how they're performing. Can we get early warning signs when someone needs help, when someone needs intervention?
So there's a difference between can we glean and can we surface for the learner?
Right, and can we sell it to someone to deliver ads based on how many times they've, or can we sell ads based on sort of what statistics, textbooks do you need because you've watched a certain statistics video over and over again.
So this is where you get into that tension between what can be monetized and what's valuable to the learner.
Well, and I think that this is what's also interesting about this sort of flood of investment that we're seeing right now in education technology, is that a lot of this investment does need to have a return, and it's not necessarily a social return. It's not necessarily a return on investment for the learner or even for the institution. A lot of it is return on investment for venture capitalists who are very excited about the education revolution.
Okay, so I also think with regard to data, there is the difficulty of, because we can't measure the things that we value most, we tend to value the things that we can measure. And education has always sort of felt protected from that, but it feels like we're increasingly losing that protection.
I think that this is something that certainly at the K-12 level we're seeing with the pressures around standardized testing, that because of the connections between sort of funding and now perhaps even teachers' jobs being connected to how well students perform on tests, then preparing for tests become the focus. And so I think that that's sort of a cautionary note for higher ed as higher ed starts to explore learning analytics within its platforms, to think about, how do we make sure that we're not sort of going down a path where we're sort of choosing to use certain technologies because they are expedient, because they can sort of help us crunch numbers more easily. I think that my fear about robo-graders probably ties into this, sort of this pressures now to sort of find ways that we can automate essay grading to help make it easier for us to sort of glean whether or not students are doing well without having to use those messy teaching assistants that
which for me
unionize.
Is very different than this idea of the Prius dashboard that tells me as the driver things that help me become a better driver or make choices and decisions versus someone else controlling the car, and I'm just sitting there as a passenger wherever the car takes me.
It is sort of ironic that the self-driving car person, Sebastian Thrun, is now doing education, isn't it? I was trying to find a picture of him actually wearing Google glasses, but I was so frightened by that image of the future that I decided not to even go there.
Okay, I said we were going to move on, but we cannot not talk about textbooks.
We could talk about textbooks.
No, we're not. We were going to talk about textbooks.
Okay.
So textbooks is a delivery method. Why haven't we fired the textbook?
Is this a trick question?
No. This is me leading you on. So does the textbook still serve a valid role in a world in which we can aggregate, curate content online in ways that are much more manageable than the textbook?
I mean, I think that the textbook certainly has a lengthy history of being able to gather together sort of expert voices, expert resources, package them nicely, and sell them to schools and to students. I do think that we're in a position now where it's possible to find those resources and assemble those resources on their own. I think the challenge is always, how can instructors easily I almost said efficiently. We won't use that word. How can instructors sort of easily do so with sort of limited time? And are the materials available, openly licensed, so that they can assemble them, remix them, mash them up, and use them in interesting ways? But yeah, we could ditch the textbook.
Well, it feels like a lot of the conversation around textbooks now is a little bit of a red herring. Right, that how is the textbook selected? What's the pricing of it? Is there a comparison of pricing? How is it ordered? That all of these questions kind of take up space and time and attention versus sort of the core question of, is this the right delivery mechanism for textbooks? Why is there so much conversation about how the textbooks are priced and who's reviewing them?
I mean, I would say in a nutshell, because this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And so there's a lot at stake in terms of the publishers, who I think are scrambling for, the world of a publisher in general is sort of up in the air right now with the move to digital content. And so I do think that publishers are sort of seeing that printed materials are perhaps going away, and how can they sort of add new bells and whistles? Like on a textbook on the iPad, you can go like this, which is supposedly like a selling feature for, that these are sort of new and exciting.
I love going like
that. I know. I probably would have become a scientist if only in my 8th grade textbook I could have gone like this on a picture of a mitochondria. It would have made all the difference.
Me too.
Instead
we're here.
I know. Instead I ended up with majoring in English. So.
We've also talked about why there isn't a good digital textbook. Why haven't digital textbooks taken off?
I think that there are a lot of reasons. I think that textbook publishers would say that they do have good digital textbooks. Again, I wonder.
But they're not selling in large quantity. I mean, they haven't overtaken the market. There's still a very small percentage of textbook sales.
I mean, I think that there are lots of sort of factors around that. One of the things is that when college students in particular are spending hundreds of dollars on a textbook, they want to be able to sell it back at the end of the school year, and you can't actually sell back your digital copy. So, and I'm not sure that they're quite easy yet to take notes on. You can't share them with your friends. So there are a lot of sort of technology factors that actually make digital textbooks not work for students.
Technology and financial factors.
Right.
Yeah, intriguing. We've also talked about the complexity of licensing rights when you take a textbook electronically and you're trying to create some methodology for sharing comments, which feels like that's kind of the holy grail of the electronic book, right? Is that you and I are reading a book and we're able to have a conversation that springboards from the book in some sort of a social form. And it seems as though there are just some legal issues relating to sort of how text gets excerpted from books that are going to make this a much harder process than we would like it to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing a number of ongoing lawsuits right now, probably most famously around like Google Books, just with this notion of digitizing content. But you're right, people are very concerned that and I think that publishers are concerned that they might lose this grip on content the way in which the record industry lost its control.
So why is Khan Academy a MacGuffin?
Should we explain what a MacGuffin is?
Explain what a MacGuffin is.
So a MacGuffin is, for folks who are not Hitchcock fans, this idea from Alfred Hitchcock that there would be something in the movie that would sort of suck viewers into the story, but it wasn't actually
wasn't the core key.
It wasn't the core key. So the famous MacGuffin is the money that's stolen in Psycho. So why is
Khan Academy a MacGuffin?
I think in some ways it's because we're very interested in the free video content, the free online content. This notion that anyone can access this wealth of video material. And I think that there are other things that are happening around Khan Academy. I think part of it is the data. Part of it is Khan Academy building out this platform for this larger platform that has to do with teaching. But I think that it's also a MacGuffin, as I said earlier, in terms of it's allowing us to have conversations about flipping the classroom, about how we teach. So it isn't really just the videos that he's making. Actually, I don't know if he still makes them in his closet, but for a while. I doubt it, right. But it isn't just the video per se, but it's this whole sort of conversation that's opening up.
So there's a way in which, as a MacGuffin, Khan Academy is potentially introducing other sort of darker themes around student information and data, but also in a very positive way, it's not the end game story, right? It's leading us into these conversations that are so valuable about what really is going on in that environment.
I mean, hopefully it is. I mean, I think that one of the things that people have, that I have some concern about with Khan Academy, is that it is being described as sort of the messiah of education, which connects with sort of other narratives that the American education system is broken, that teachers are lousy, that no one knows how to teach math, and that we need the sort of savior to come in and rescue all of us, rescue the world, really, from terrible math teachers.
Our savior needs a little more humility.
Don't we all?
Okay, so you also wrote about another investment in Edmodo. $25 million, bringing the total investment in this ed tech company up to $47.5 million. Why is this problematic?
Well, I'm not sure if higher ed folks are familiar with Edmodo. This is largely a K through 12 social network that's been designed specifically for schools. And it's in many ways a workaround for the fact that it is difficult in that setting to use social networks. You certainly couldn't ask your third graders to share their assignments on Facebook. But Edmodo has raised $47.5 million, as you said, and it has no revenue. And so you do have to wonder what the investors will want and when the investors will want their return. And I'm concerned anytime I see, and we can talk, again, we'll talk about MOOCs this way, concern when you see a bunch of money being invested in technologies when the business plan is still being worked on.
And that also goes to the sort of question of ownership of student data.
Well, right. I mean, this is, Douglas Rushkoff famously said that if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. And I think that this is something that we should think about in terms of all of these technologies, particularly these social technologies that we're using. I mean, we are the product on Facebook. We share our data. We like all sorts of things. We're giving all sorts of signals to people and then that information is being sold elsewhere. Now, Edmodo, I should say, insists that it will not share student data. It's not going to sell student data. It has no plans to sell student data. But once you've raised $47.5 million and you have no revenue, I think that the opportunities will have to come somewhere to make money.
So there's this question of kind of the lens that we look through when we're thinking of education as a sort of a Silicon Valley investment, right? It's sort of McDonald's. The lens is growth. It's number of billion served. So in order to get there, they serve sort of bland food that can be mass produced. I mean, that's not a criticism. It's just that's how they get there. Right, but so the lens isn't sort of high quality, nutritious, ethnic food. So as we see more and more sort of acceptance of Silicon Valley's role or venture capital roles in education, is it changing our lens?
I mean, I think right now we're quite excited about these opportunities, and rightly so. I mean, I think that there are a lot of well-established large corporations in education and education technology, the textbook publishers being one of them, certainly learning management systems that are now sort of scrambling, partially because their products have been sort of crap, that they're struggling to sort of, how do they respond to these new technologies and exciting things that look more exciting. I mean, I think that Blackboard is a great example of a tool that today looks very similar to when I used it in college, 10 years
How
ago.
many years ago?
I was doing some math there. See, if I had only had the mitochondria, I could have done the math, and I wouldn't had to count on my fingers to 10. But I think that we're seeing new companies come along that are creating products that they just look sexier, right? They look as though they're doing something. They look like Facebook. And so I think that there is some excitement around new, innovative applications that are being built that are sort of challenging some of these dominant players. And I think that a lot of the excitement around revolution is the education revolution has to do with sort of overthrowing not just sort of the academic institutions, but actually sort of upending some of these major players in the sector as well. Because this is big money. I mean, the education market is huge, mind-bogglingly huge.
I mean, there's another connection with food as well, which is I don't go to a restaurant now without checking the reviews of the restaurant online. So the institution of the restaurant, whether it's a large chain or a small restaurant, they no longer have control over the message of how good their food is. So are we seeing that same kind of loss of control over, by large organizations selling into education, that they can kind of control the message, and is there now sort of a grassroots willingness to be critical?
I think that this is one of the interesting things that we're seeing. I mean, I think that both at higher ed and K through 12, for a long time, a lot of education content was sold to the institution. And so you would wheel and deal sort of at, make deals at the institutional level. You perhaps would take people out for dinner, take them on. If you're Pearson, you would fly them to foreign countries for lavish
really?
weekend getaways. I know, we're totally in the wrong business, huh?
Although we have a very nice room here.
We do. So.
Not separate rooms.
So the
that would have been interesting.
But I think that we are seeing now, I mean, partially because of sort of the ubiquity of mobile devices, that people are making, teachers and students are making their own decisions. They aren't necessarily, even if schools have adopted something like Blackboard, I'll pick on Blackboard because why not? But even if schools have adopted something, teachers and students are recognizing that there are options, and they are sort of working around that system. And I think that a lot of entrepreneurs are recognizing too that they can sell directly to students and teachers and not have to fly people to foreign countries and take them on golf tours. I think that then we come back to this problem that you end up much like Edmodo, which gives its tool away for free to teachers and students, and then down the road you struggle with how indeed then do you sell to institutions, how do you make money?
And interestingly, at the same time that there's this question of appropriateness of the influence of money in that way, it feels as though the foundations have actually moved more toward the model of the businesses with regard to the money and the influence.
I think that this is definitely something interesting to watch. I mean, and I think the rise of the Gates Foundation as one of the dominant players in funding education reform is certainly part of this. The money that's going into education right now, not from the public sector, not from tax dollars, but from sort of VC investment and from philanthrocapitalism, is certainly taking education down a certain path.
So we've talked about the lens. We've talked about the influence of the money. What about hubris? Is this a part of the story?
I think it is. I mean, and I spend a lot of time talking to folks in Silicon Valley, or talking to folks not just in Silicon Valley. It's sort of shorthand for the technology sector. That I think really do feel as though they are going to save the world, save education. And I think that on one hand, I think that's a sort of an honorable endeavor to decide that instead of making the next great photo sharing app, that you're going to make an education startup. I think that's wonderful because goodness knows the world has enough photo sharing apps. But I do think that there's a lot of folks who are entering the education sector whose really only experience in education is that they were in school once, but feel as though because they are sort of part of this new wave of entrepreneurship and new wave of have engineering skills, that they're going to fix things, and they know better than the rest of us. That's why I devised the Audrey test.
Yes, tell us about the Audrey test.
There's a very famous software test called the Joel test, named after Joel Spolsky, who created a website called Stack Overflow, where programmers could sort of answer each other questions. And he had a test to sort of see when you're he could ask and sort of within 5 questions decide if someone was really had sort of no idea what they were doing. And someone challenged me to come up with a list of questions to sort of see if any of these new education technology entrepreneurs had a clue about what they were doing. And some people ask me all the time after I meet with someone is sort of, would anyone pass the Audrey test? And now I feel terribly guilty and punitive and for coming up with a...
Give us an example of what's on the Audrey test.
Oh, what's connectivism? Who invented the MOOC? Stanford is not the right answer.
We're going to get there. So what's interesting to me about this is the idea that we would look to someone like Bill Gates as being someone who could solve education or would be even an expert in it. When we have people who've studied for decades sort of deeply on education, that why do we see education as a problem that hasn't been solved? That if education is a problem that hasn't been solved, then nobody smart has actually looked at it. So now we have this new crop of very smart people who are going to solve it. Is education a problem to solve? Is that even the wrong way to frame the question?
I mean, I think that's part of the problem is that the narrative sort of the narrative around a broken system sort of necessitates then that someone has to come along and fix it. Which isn't to say that there aren't plenty of things that education, but again, both K-12 and higher ed are struggling with. But this notion that somehow that technology is necessarily and sort of almost uncritically the solution, I think is, it needs to be unpacked. The other thing is I think that we just don't, in general, I think we just forget history. A lot of us assume that we're the first people who've ever come up with this idea, that no one has ever thought of this before, that no one has ever, until the iPad came along, there was no education technology, that this notion of sort of putting video or having your courses videotaped was invented by Sal Khan. Again, sort of this really sort of short-term history.
It feels like
amnesia.
Educational amnesia.
Educational amnesia.
So it feels like it's not just hubris, but it's also a sort of pervasive sense, sort of an American sense, that enthusiasm can overcome deep knowledge, right? So 6 weeks, Teach for America teacher is going to be able to go in and do better than a regular teacher, right? So why do we think that enthusiasm somehow overcomes the value of deep thinking?
I mean, I do think that it is absolutely part of the, part of our American culture. I think it's also, in some ways, it's part of the entrepreneurial spirit, which is great. This notion that, to hell with the rest of the world, to hell with everyone telling me I could never do this. I'm going to take the risk and I'm going to make a difference. And I think there's something really exciting about that. And I think that you can watch, you see someone drop out of Harvard and become a billionaire, and that seems like a pretty exciting American story.
So I think it's worth sort of diving a
and that
little
could be
bit.
Either Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg, right?
It certainly wasn't me.
Wasn't me either. Or an English major.
So it feels like this might be a good time to talk a little bit about entrepreneurship, because it does feel as though that we can make a distinction, right? There's entrepreneurship that responds to needs. They may not know a lot about education, but they are responsive to what educators are asking for, and they shape a product. I'm going to use Instructure as an example. I mean, I feel like that kind of comes out of that model. Agile development, quickly find out. We may not know, we don't say we know a lot about education, but we listen to our customers and we change the product. And then there's this other kind of entrepreneurship, which is sort of this hubris enthusiasm. We're going to reshape it without listening. Is that a fair separation?
I think that's a pretty interesting separation, particularly when you think about what's this this notion that you needn't necessarily have an education or a background in education. You needn't have been an educator to sort of become an education technology entrepreneurship. But certainly at some point along the way, you probably should talk to a teacher. I know, shocking. And I think making some assumptions about, I think that there are a lot of assumptions made about what schools need, what schools want. And this notion that it ties back into this narrative that if school's broken, then I'll fix it. And I'll fix it with my app that you can download for free.
So part of what I like about this is what you and I do, these conversations, that this is part of the sort of messy process of how innovation changes things, because people are going to try some things and they're going to work, and they're going to try others and they're not. And it's sort of fun to watch how this sort of shakes out and how our conversations become increasingly informed about where we think progress is being made. Mm-hmm. Finally, sort of an interesting note on the software piece. It feels like some of the best software solutions that are being brought into education have not been designed for education, but were created outside of education and fulfilled human needs. Do you think that's true?
I think that I'm always fascinated by that. Edmodo is a great example. So Edmodo was a social network designed for schools. And I think that there are, particularly, as I said, at the K-12 level, reasons why people wouldn't want to use Facebook or Twitter. But I do think we're seeing Twitter being adopted to great extent by teachers for their own professionals network, but also by students to connect around courses that they're taking. Twitter has no clue about education. Twitter has no clue about how to make money. Twitter has no clue about a lot of things, but I do think that we're seeing people adopt the tool to that end. Evernote would be another right. company that's certainly seeing people finding that it works for them in their own personal lives, and then tweaking it in some way to work for their classes, work for their own learning.
Google Docs, Evernote, Ning. I find that a lot of the things that I use that really inform what I do were not designed for education. It almost feels like sometimes designing for education might be a trap.
Well, but I think the twist then, I think that there are sometimes issues around that. I think the iPad is an example of a tool that wasn't designed, despite Apple from time to time liking to remind us that the education is in their DNA. That I think made me guffaw at their. I
would like to see a guffaw. Could you produce a guffaw right now?
No, I don't think so. but I do think that now that we're seeing iPad sort of being adopted just at a shocking rate in schools, I think that there are some problems. We're running into all sorts of problems with something that is a consumer tool being used in the classroom. And I think a lot of this comes back to issues of data, issues of control, and the sort of things that happen around consumer technologies, again, the selling of advertising, the things that we for a long time not wanted to happen in an education setting. We don't want our students to be bombarded. I'll say we. We don't want students to be bombarded with ads while they're reading their free textbook. Maybe some people. Which
does lead to an interesting category of companies that are creating education products that are not selling to institutional education, like Skillshare. It's about teaching and learning, but has nothing to do with formal education. Some that we would say are commendable, and others that just seem like kind of financial Wall Street plays.
Yeah, there's a lot of
Okay. So you were recently at the Open Source Conference, the
Yes.
O'Reilly Open Source Conference.
Yes.
In fact, you were co-chair of the Open Source Strand,
the
or Education Strand.
Right.
Why does it feel like some of these conferences have gone to the dark side?
Ooh. I write for O'Reilly Media, so
okay, we'll shift gears quickly here.
Disclosure there on that one. No, I think that I'm fascinated by this notion that open has become one of the keywords or one of the buzzwords in education that we're just slapping on everything, whether or not it's open, whether or not it's open source, whether or not it's open license. the open is just the adjective du jour in education. Now, I wouldn't say that that's necessarily what happened at OSCON, but I do think that if you look around the things that are calling themselves open, say MOOCs, the Stanford MOOCs, that I should qualify the Stanford MOOCs, that we should ask some questions about exactly what we mean by open. Do we mean the code is open? Do we mean the content is openly licensed? Do we mean that people are transparent with what's happening in the formulation of these tools, or do we just mean that we've added the adjective open?
But it does feel like South by Southwest, OSCON maybe to a lesser degree, but some of these other conferences, they've really ceased to be sort of outside fringe revolutionary voices and are now kind of following the money as well.
I think if you look at the economy right now, Silicon Valley, the tech sector in particular is booming. I mean, Apple on Tuesday had its quarterly report that analysts called disappointing because they only made $8.8 billion.
I sold my stock.
Yeah, to hell with them. They're done.
Okay, but at OSCON, Tim O'Reilly gave what I think is going to become kind of a seminal talk.
Yes, and Tim O'Reilly is the person who coined the term Web 2.0
He and Dale.
Quite some time ago. But he gave what I thought was a really interesting talk on something called the clothesline paradox. And that's this notion that when we hang clothes out to dry in the sun, that there's no accounting for that energy. Whereas if we put our clothes in the dryer, that the little meter spins and that electricity is counted. And that we actually don't count solar. When you see the pie graph of the energy consumption, renewable resources are a tiny fraction, and solar is the tiny, tiny fraction of that. And we overlook all of the ways in which the sun impacts our world, not just hanging clothes to dry, but, say, growing food, melting Greenland, all the great things that the sun is doing for us. And so Tim was talking about what does it mean when we have such a failure of accounting? How is money and profit really driving things? And what are we failing to count? Coming back to this question the comment you made earlier about, data, we only count if you only count certain things, then those things become what matters. And so Tim was making the argument that businesses need to, entrepreneurs need to do something that matters. They need to actually create value, not just extract value. And I think that that's something that in education, this notion of creating value and sharing value and giving away knowledge is something that I think motivates many people to sort of be part of education. And I think that, how can we reinstill that sort of sharing and gift economy into the rest of the world? And how can we sort of perhaps account for things in a different way so that we do start recognizing what matters as something more than just profit.
He's been a personal hero of mine for a long time, in part because of what he has said about money, that it becomes a means for doing good things, and very thoughtful. He also says he's reminding us not to extract all of the value, right? So if you're providing a service or benefit, to remember that there's sort of this long picture that goes beyond the quarter, right? That it's important to give more than you take out of a system. And I'm wondering if the history of our country in the last 30 years has led us to this over-reliance on financial measures as a view of success, that it's really important for education, and specifically higher education, to push back on, especially when we talk about graduates are going to make X number of dollars depending on what degree they get.
Right. It's back to the English degree again. No, I think that these are the conversations that we're certainly seeing education be reframed in certain ways. What is the purpose of education, or what is the purpose of going to college? And certainly, it's a lot of it. We are moving away from a conversation about sort of the liberal arts degree, or sort of students learning to sort of explore a variety of subjects in order to sort of become a well-informed citizen, to this notion of how can we churn out people who will have the right skills to meet the right jobs and to fill sort of gaps in the labor market. It's become very instrumental, and certainly the focus is on the money.
So let's talk about churning out and switch to MOOCs, shall we?
Ooh, yes.
Okay, so what is going on with MOOCs? How did a
I don't
four-letter
know.
acronym that reminds you of a cow all of a sudden become the talk of the town?
I think again, it has to do with this moment right now that we're facing where Silicon Valley is, I think, the sweetheart of the economy, and it's certainly the media is fascinated by what's happening in and around Silicon Valley. Certainly, their MOOCs predate Stanford's experiment last fall.
I don't think so. I think they invented MOOCs.
Right. They did tell me that, but they said that they I can't remember. I won't misquote them. So, but I do think that there's something about that story, the story that the media was able to craft in the fall around the Stanford AI class in particular, that and coinciding with other stories around education as well, student loan debt. We don't have enough skilled engineers, that this notion of having 160,000 people in an artificial intelligence class seemed like a pretty compelling story, and I think that that Stanford has certainly run with it.
Can we call that a panacea story? I mean, was part of the attractiveness of it that it seems like here's an easy solution to big, difficult issues?
I think that it is on one hand serving a need, which is the sort of a demand for people. I think people are really curious. People are really interested. People want to learn, and certainly an opportunity to learn how to learn artificial intelligence from the man who invented the self-driving car was appealing. I signed up for the class. I dropped out when I realized I was in way over my head. But I think that it is exciting for people to sort of think about ways to participate in this.
So it's exciting. There's a little bit of a rush, right? There's Coursera signed on 12 universities.
Last week, so Coursera, so Stanford held the classes in the fall, and then they've had two startups, two for-profit startups spin out of it, Coursera being one of them, and they just signed on 12 universities last week, including, of course, the University of Virginia, which...
Oh, one of our favorite stories.
Yeah, so thinking about, again, sort of this, in some ways it feels as though higher ed is in defensive mode and trying to protect itself from a lot of different forces. And so a lot of universities, I think, are seeing the MOOCs as being something that makes them look like they're hanging out with the cool kids, right? The cool kids at Stanford are doing MOOCs. I think the cool kids in Canada are doing MOOCs, but they don't seem to get a lot of credit for that.
So it's worth telling what happened at the University of Virginia, right? There was a feeling by the board that the school was not moving fast enough.
Right. They read a David Brooks op-ed, and they thought, holy crap, there's a campus tsunami coming. Why don't we have a MOOC?
And the result of that was the firing of the campus president.
Right.
The university president.
Meanwhile, in Stanford, some folks from University of Virginia were meeting with Coursera and finding out ways for the university to have MOOCs.
But it felt like that was you didn't jump on the bandwagon fast enough. And I've always sort of felt like part of the value of higher ed was making moves thoughtfully. And
part of I think what Silicon Valley likes is just jumping. Jump quickly. Jump.
Right.
Because if that's opportunity, that's innovation, and move quickly, the rest of the world moves way too slowly.
MIT and Harvard make an announcement. Berkeley's now come on for a different, for a similar concept, but I actually like the take a little bit better.
Why?
Right? So they said we're going to create a joint endeavor, but we're going to study where the learning actually takes place, and that felt to me like it was respectful of here's something moving very fast that people are really excited about. Let's figure out if it really works and where it works, and then build the spots where it does.
For me, that was there were a couple of things that make what's called edX now, the Harvard and MIT initiative interesting. And partially I think that they are planning to open source this platform. So MIT has been building some of the technology, again with robot graders, because for some reason that's exciting for artificial intelligence.
I want to be
folks.
graded by a robot.
Yeah, okay. But they're open sourcing this platform, and this notion is, of course, that universities will be able to adopt that without having to sort of sign your life away to some of these for-profit companies. So I do think that the open source is an interesting part. But again, it comes back to this picture that it is very much still this model where we're going to give you some video content, some multiple choice questions, and hopefully by the end of the class, we'll have efficiently delivered this content into your brain for free. Yay! But
there's a reality there as well. I need to be more respectful of this. That the world now favors the autodidact, right? That in a world of sort of unlimited access to information, if you're the kind of person who can learn on your own, you now have a lot of opportunity you didn't have before.
I think that, and I do think that that's really important. I think that what's one of the things that we'll have to start thinking about in terms of, all the way back, in early childhood, how do we raise children who are autodidacts? Because I'm not sure that
or agents,
right, or certainly have agencies for their own learning. Because I don't think that's really what we do in the K through 12 setting. And so I do think that there are opportunities, and I do think it is a great time if you want to learn anything. But I think for me at least, learning isn't just about filling my brain with knowledge. It's also interacting with other people and learning in dialogue with other people. And I don't see a lot of dialogue happening in a class of 100,000 students.
So is that why the history here is so important?
I think why the social piece, or
why the history of where MOOCs actually started is important.
Yes, and I think it's really interesting too that that the history of the connectivist history, this notion that MOOCs very much are about sort of creating knowledge, forging your own path, connecting with people, making community. I do think it's really interesting that time and time again we can talk about MOOCs with no mention of George Siemens, no mention of Stephen Downes, no mention of David, who actually is responsible for the term MOOC, which unfortunately.
Right. So what is connectivism?
I think it's this notion that we learn in networks, and that is one of the beautiful things that technology enables. It isn't just the scaling of systems; it's actually helping us connect with people across the world, connect to resources across the world, and build our knowledge from there. Again, rather than just sort of this top-down process of filling our brains.
I actually feel like that's the perfect place to stop.
Great.
Thank you, Audrey.
Thank you, Steve.
We're going to go to Q&A. What was that like for you as an experience to have us be holding this conversation? I felt kind of badly that I was facing Audrey. And comments, questions, thoughts, ideas? Now you know why I like Audrey so much.
Hi, Beth Harris and Stephen Zucker here of the Khan Academy.
Oh, hello.
Hi, everybody. We just wanted to thank you guys a lot for raising some important issues, and we hope you'll come tomorrow to our talk in the morning tomorrow morning when we sort of talk about our story of Khan Academy and smart history. So thank you.
Thank you for being so thoughtful.
Yes. And thank you for having content on there that's not just math and science.
I'm waiting for someone from Stanford to stand up.
I know. Pearson, Stanford,
I did grow up there. I went to
Blackboard.
Stanford. I feel some
Well,
ability.
you're not going to get that. I'm Michelle Pacansky-Brock. Hi, Beth. Hi, Stephen. And I guess I represent community colleges, and I don't know if there's many community college folks here today or not, but as a community college instructor, I always kind of feel that learners are very, very dear to my heart, and I think that when I think about what we're talking about here, I'm really thinking about how technology is changing the way we teach, but I think about the way it is empowering learners to understand how they learn. And I think that that's one of the ways that it has transformed me as a teacher, is that it's made me very aware of, like I am completely MOOC illiterate. I can't learn in a MOOC. And I think that that's really valuable for me to know. And I also think that when it comes to online learning, I wrote a blog post about 1.5 years ago about online learning is like dinner. And I made that same analogy. And I think that as institutions in the future need to figure that out. And for me, I guess one of the things I want to ask everyone in this room and you too is, do you think about maybe, is the future of an institution less about delivering courses and more about figuring out what the learning experience is going to look like for the student?
I think that that's a really important question, and I would say that that's one of the things that the takeaway that I've had from my experience as a student in MOOCs is exactly the same, sort of realizing that I tune out to lectures. I mean, I think one of the differences that Udacity's lectures are 2 minutes long, and I realized that I have about a 2-minute attention span for video content, which is really sort of sad and pathetic. But I also recognize the things that keep me motivated are being in contact with other learners, and I think that
Absolutely.
and so I think that, recognizing that I'm not going to do well in a setting where I'm supposed to watch a bunch of 20-minute videos by myself, even though supposedly 100,000 students are participating alongside. I don't know where they are. I don't want to go to the discussion forums to find them, and so I do think that helping learners identify what works for them is really, really important, particularly students who are going to have to I think at the community college level, or non-traditional students who aren't sort of being taken through a 4-year period from the age of 18 to 22, where things are sort of crafted for their young adult minds. So I do think that's important, but I think that how institutions will respond to that, I think, remains to be seen. I mean, are institutions going to help, again, offer this sort of personalized experience, or are students going to start choosing schools based on precisely this thing? So you would actually choose a residential experience because you feel as though you want a football team, you want a fraternity experience, you want a certain sort of set of experiences, or is there just some sort of skill or knowledge that you want to attain and that you are perfectly comfortable or perfectly able to find that online?
Yeah.
I'm interested in sort of the contrast between schools that seem to be trying to play catch-up or mirror what the Stanfords and the Harvards are doing, and smaller colleges that seem to be taking a different approach, where they are creating a differentiated view of learning that's really compelling. And those are the stories I really like. Mm-hmm. BYU Idaho's learning model, or I'm in Park City, Utah, and there's I think it's called Winchester College, and they've got very defined learning outcomes, and I love that movement.
Since you asked for somebody from Stanford to speak up, I thought you'd be interested to know that Stanford's really just experimenting to figure out what works, and the press runs amok on various topics, as you know, and the Coursera and Udacity spinouts were not things that were really done at Stanford Initiative, but Stanford encourages experiments of all kinds, not just on campus, but it also allows professors to experiment off campus. So I think a lot of good things are happening both externally at Udacity and Coursera, as well as on campus. So on campus, Stanford is trying to figure out how best to use online technologies for teaching its own students, as well as wondering about how the future will evolve with things like MOOCs. So it does seem like there's a confluence in time here where technology is creating opportunities for enhanced student learning. And Stanford's trying to figure out how best to do that. And so I just wanted to say I'd be happy to talk to anybody about what Stanford's doing if you're curious.
Well, I am a proud alum, and I actually really like what Keith Devlin is doing with the math MOOC that's coming up this fall. I mean, the story is obviously more complex than we portray. So thanks for bringing that up.
I think that this idea of experimentation is really important, and I do think that this is it's wonderful that we're actually trying new things and looking to see what actually benefits students, what will benefit professors, what would benefit the institution. But I think that on the other hand, I think that, we are actually talking about, we have responsibilities to students. And I think that, when you're talking about experimenting with education, and we are talking about, what we're doing with, I'll say kids because they're kids. What are we doing with kids, and particularly at the K-12 level? How are we experimenting with other kids' children or other people's children? And so, although on one hand, I do think that it's wonderful that we are taking some risks, I think that we still need to sort of, before we get too excited about the fact that sort of this is going to change everything, this is the death of higher education that we know it, and we're going to sort of dance on its grave. I do think that we need to recognize that, this experimenting in education is a very different thing than experimenting with video games.
Isn't there also, I appreciate the thoughtfulness of that comment, but it also feels like both with Khan Academy and with Stanford, there's a temptation when you're getting that much visibility and publicity to not be as humble about what you're actually doing as was described thoughtfully here. I wish Saul would say in a couple of cases, this is just a part of the puzzle, and some of this criticism is actually kind of accurate, and we're trying to figure it out. Instead, maybe that it's the reporting or the sound bites, but it does feel like hubris comes in quickly.
Right. Well, and I think that I think as much as sort of some of these entrepreneurs can be accused of sort of not knowing history, I think that the press as well, the press loves the story of, I think, the press are certainly the ones that have called Saul Khan a messiah. I don't think that this is something that he has on his business card. Maybe he does. I don't think he does. And I would say that the same thing goes for some of these other things as well. I don't think that. But then again, you do hear folks. The Stanford president is, I think, the person who's calling this a campus tsunami. So I do think that the press is definitely responsible for reporting using revolution, disruption in almost every headline. I often think I'm going to make a drinking game around headlines around education technology, but then I would be in a state of drunken stupor all day long. So.
Hi. Rissa Karpoff, Laureate Education. I saw a wonderful video on TED in which Charles Leadbeater of the Demos think tank said education is a global religion and education plus technology is a great source of hope. And I think about things like what Sugata Mitra is doing with the Hole in the Wall project and minimally invasive education. And we've spoken today mostly about how technology-enabled education compares with a sort of traditional on-campus higher ed experience. But I wondered if you would take a moment to speak about what technology can do to make higher ed, or even K-12 ed, available to people who did not previously have access.
I think that this is something that is really you're right, is really sort of exciting about the opportunity right now that, all of this information that we have that used to sort of be bound in textbooks, or sort of trapped in, at least in the sort of the mind of professors or the mind of the teacher, is now available for anyone, for anyone with internet access at least to be able to get their hands on. I think that, but I do think that we as we sort of rush down the excitement of what technology can provide, that it is interesting to see the ways in which we are sort of reinscribing offline practices and old models of thinking about technology into these new capabilities. And again, I think that the fact that we're erasing the connectivist history of MOOCs and just focusing on the Stanford model is pretty indicative of when it comes to sort of learner agency, when it comes to constructing knowledge in new and exciting ways, the things that technology can do that are very different. That we are overlooking those opportunities and instead focusing on the things that are sort of monetizable and sort of mundane.
I think we're almost out of time. I want to make sure we're being sensitive to that. Did somebody want to wave at us if we're supposed to be closing? Yes, we're supposed to. Are we done? Thank you so much.